Good morning. This is Rebecca Smith Aldridge, the MidHudson Library Systems Coordinator for Library Sustainability, and I'm the administrator of the State Aid for Library Construction program here on behalf of the state in our region for the MidHudson Library System. So today what we're going to be doing is doing an overview and an introduction, a very basic introduction to the aid program and what it looks like to apply for money through this program here in the MidHudson Library System. This workshop is designed for people who have never applied for this grant before. It's extremely basic information. If you have applied before, this will absolutely be a review of many things you already know. There is not too much new compared to any application you did in the last year or two. So we do ask that you understand that it's designed for first-time applicants as we go through this. So as we said, we're being recorded, so we'll be able to send this to everyone after today, as well as give you the slides. So we don't want anyone's hand cramping up while you're listening to what the content of the day is today. Let's get started with just an overview of the program itself. This is a state program. Oh, here we go. This is a state program that's put into the New York State budget, which was just approved a few weeks ago. We want to thank everyone who helped advocate for this grant program because we're seeing a record amount of money listed in the budget for this grant program. And to be clear, I should not call it a grant program. It's an aid program. It's actually funds that are bonded through the Dormitory Authority and then administered by the Division of Library Development, or DLD, who you might be used to dealing with for your annual report to the state. And the way they administer that is by putting the control of the recommendations for award amounts into the hands of the 23 public library systems. So while there's $34 million statewide, this money is portioned out via a formula through the 23 public library systems. So for example, last year we had $24 million and the amount MidHudson received was just under $900,000. So we're anticipating when the tables come out, which they haven't yet, that MidHudson will see, fingers crossed, over $1 million for the MidHudson Library System region this year, which is quite a change. I've been administering this program for close to 15 years, and when I started, MidHudson got just over $29,000 to dole out amongst the library. So the idea of having $1 million to help out libraries with is pretty exciting. So we want to make sure the maximum number of libraries have the opportunity to apply for this grant and get as much money out of the program as possible. So one of the thresholds we want to make everyone aware of is there is a minimum grant award noted in the regulation, which means your project cost must be at least $5,000. And honestly, once you see the amount of work that goes into doing this application, you might decide even that is too low for your blood, but that's certainly a decision that you can make locally, and I'm happy to help you do that. So to be clear, the minimum grant award is $2,500, and there's no cap on the max award amount. And we'll talk a lot about the matching requirements and what to expect on that end of the process. But I wanted to point out on this slide that the program is outlined by the Commissioner's regulations in Title 8. So Education 90.12 is where most of the eligibility and administration information we're sharing today is coming from. So I'll point out to you where things that are listed are in regulation, not under MidHudson's control. And then I'll point out to you where the MidHudson Board has made some decisions that we need to abide by through this process to make sure that's clear for everyone. So this grant program period is actually a 3-year grant program period starting July 1st of this year. There are some cost issues if you've laid out money for items prior to July 1 for the project you'd like to apply for that we'll make clear throughout this morning's webinar. But you would need to wrap up your entire project that you apply for no later than June 30th, 2021. There are chances to do amendments, but we really want to see projects that are well thought out, that have been sometimes years in the making, but certainly everyone's on the same page about going for the project they'd like to apply for, and there is certainty that's the project you want to do and you're going to be wrapping it up. Those of you who have come to this webinar year after year are probably used to me saying this, but I'm going to go ahead and say it again. You may not give money back in this process. Once you are committed to this money, which you'll have a two chances to decide whether or not you want to move forward once you find out what the recommended award amount is. Once you sign that memo and say we're doing this project with this grant, you are doing that project with that grant. There might be a bid that comes in a little less or a little more, and you have to adjust your scope, but we're really looking for libraries that are certain they're doing these projects, not speculative projects, not, oh, we'll do it maybe if we feel like it next year. We're looking for libraries that have a facility plan, they know what they're doing, they know what their outcomes are, and they're ready to roll with this year's round of funding. So just take a look at the timeline and give you a sense of how things flow here. This timeline has begun as of April 6th. Once we heard the budget had passed and that there was definitely money in the budget for the state aid for library construction program, we went ahead and issued what's called an action memo here at MidHudson. That went out to every library director through the MidHudson Notices listserv, and it has two parts to it, which we'll review here today. But that memo is due on May 25th, and it is the first step to applying this year. So we'll answer any questions you might have about that actually on our next slide. So the state library last week indicated that all signs indicate they will have the online application portal open on June 1st. For those of you that have gone through this before, you know they almost always say that, and it almost is never true. They sounded extra confident this year, though, so we'll believe them. But there is a possibility it might not come through until later in June. However, that does not change the deadline that we have to abide by here at MidHudson, because it does not change the deadline that we are expected to finish our work by on behalf of the state. So let's say in an ideal world, the state library is correct and the online application portal opens June 1st. You'll see opportunities for technical assistance through MidHudson throughout June and July. That comes in the form of a hands-on workshop where you can actually work on your application with me and with Joan Kay from our business office and answer any questions you might have. You can schedule time either online, by phone, or in person to get technical assistance with your application. We are here to support you during that period. And we have some advice for you before you leave here today about what you'll want to do prior to the online application portal opening to make sure you're ready to roll as soon as that application is open. So grant application deadline here in MidHudson is August 3rd. There are no extensions to that deadline. So all paperwork must be submitted at that point. And again, we are happy to help you throughout that process to get to completion on August 3rd, but we will not be extending that deadline if you are late getting a quote or you never finished writing your narrative, whatever it might be, which we all understand the nature of procrastination when it comes to grant writing, but this is a very firm deadline. There are no extensions. So after August 3rd, what happens is a vetting process. We're checking your application for completeness, making sure all of the components are in place and what you're asking for is actually eligible, which if you've been working with us before that deadline, you'll feel confident about that before we get to August 3rd. And then at the MidHudson, we have a committee of the MidHudson board called the Incentives Committee that ranks the applications that are received. And this will be an interesting year because I will say in the 15 years we've been doing this, we've always had requests for more money than has been available through the program, which means we have to make some very hard decisions about how much money each project gets. So there is a ranking paradigm in place for projects, and we're going to talk about that today. If by some miracle the number of applicants this year asks for the amount of money that we have to give out and we can give everyone their max award, that makes our job a lot easier here at MidHudson, but I've yet to see that happen. So we will review how to make sure you've positioned your library to receive the maximum award amount through this program. So at the September 12th MidHudson board meeting, recommendations from that committee are provided to the full board and they vote on the recommended award amounts at that time. Upon their approval, I reach out to you and give you the opportunity to consider the amount of money that the board is recommending for your project. And at that point in time, you have the opportunity to either accept that award amount and move forward in the process or decline the award amount if you feel that the amount of money you would have to come up for matching just isn't feasible acceptable for you at this time, there's no penalty to do that at that point. That money would then be redistributed to other libraries here in the MidHudson library system. Once you say yes, we'll take it. We'll do some work to clean up your application, make sure all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted, and make sure it's perfect when it gets up to the Division of Library Development for their review process. Once we get to that point on October 1st, all the applications go up to the state. The state staff at the Division of Library Development then reviews your grant application. So you will be grateful at that point that I put you through your paces to do your application as well as possible at that point. We don't like to see applications kicked back to us. It can slow down the whole grant award process. But they do have the right to kick back your application, ask questions, ask for corrections or adjustments to be made. Usually by Thanksgiving, although I think they're going to see a lot more applications this year than we've seen in the past, given the increase in the amount of money available. So we might be pushing into December. The Division of Library Development wraps up their review and then passes all of the applications on to the Dormitory Authority, which, if you'll recall, that's the agency that's actually bonding the money. They then also review your application, and that does take quite a while. They're going to be approaching, my guess is, over 100 applications they have to review, if not more. So in the past, I'd say 8 years since the Dormitory Authority began reviewing them, they've been pretty consistent. They don't wrap that up usually until May, if not June. And they do make us all wait until they're done with all of them. Usually what happens in June, you receive a notification of the award that was official from the state library. So while MidHudson has told you a recommended award amount in September, that amount is not final until you receive that letter from the state library. So pretty quickly thereafter, in my mind, it feels quick because the money actually does come through quite quickly after that. Within about a month, you'll see 90% of the award paid out to your library. So that's when you would actually have cash in hand over a year from now. So I think that's important to understand as you think through your cash flow issues for your project and where your matching money is coming from and when you'll be able to start the work on your project. We just want to be really clear that you don't actually see cash in hand until next summer. So we mentioned that step one of this process is the MidHudson Action Memo, which all directors have received at this point. Any director who thinks you missed that, you can check out your inbox. It came in on Friday, April 6th through the MidHudson notices list. Can't find it, just shoot me an email. We'll make sure to get that over to you. Again, this is the item that's due on May 25th. We actually ask all libraries to fill this out, even if they don't plan to apply for the construction program this year. So part one is for every library to identify your construction needs, looking at your facility plan, what are the top 3 things that are on your horizon to tackle at your library, and what are your estimated costs on those. We don't need vendor quotes or construction manager quotes on those. Whatever the estimated cost on is fine. What we actually use those particular numbers for is to help with advocacy for the money that ends up in the budget each year. So when you think about that number, $34 million, which is a record high here in New York, that's thanks to years of advocacy using data from these memos to demonstrate need in our region for this money. So in this section, we're also asking you to submit your board-approved facility plan. If you're going to apply for the aid program, you are required to have a board-approved facility plan. If you currently don't have one of those, there's support on our website, which I'm happy to point out and walk you through, where you can, I think, fairly quickly put together a facility plan to demonstrate that your board has thought through your building from a holistic standpoint and understands where is most important to put money that is received into that asset that you all are stewards of. So again, board-approved facility plan. If we don't see that in there, you will get a phone call from us if you indicated you also want to apply for the grant this year. We can't move you onto the eligibility list until we see that that's in place as per our board's instructions. So the second part is if you've said we'd like to apply for this grant this year, it's basically a checklist that helps raise your awareness of the things we're going to talk about today to make sure it's very clear that, will you have your matching money in hand in time? Will you have your contractor quotes in time? Are you clear on where matching money is coming from for your project? All things that help you prep before you get into the online application portal, which, as you saw, was a pretty tight turnaround time between when that application is available and when it's due. So the idea of the checklist there is to help you get your house in order so you're ready to go when the application comes out. So as we mentioned, this has been for 20 years a very competitive grant program. And like we said, hey, maybe there's not that many applicants this year and there's plenty of money and everyone gets exactly what they ask for. That'd be wonderful. But again, like I said, I've never seen that happen. So let's assume it's going to be a competitive grant year and make sure you've positioned your project for the maximum grant award. So I will point out we have a portion of the MidHudson website, midhudson.org/NYS construction grant / which is where many things that I'll point out today you can download and access more information on. So I'll point out those things that are available on that site and make sure you have a hot link to that page before you leave today. So first, I thought we would review what's eligible and what's not eligible under this aid program. And let's remember that the eligible costs and what is not eligible is out of MidHudson's hands. We can't change what you're about to see here based on your need. This is prescribed in the Education Commissioner's regulations, which I pointed out in section 90.12. So if you want to read that section, you're welcome to. I've parsed it out into normal people language here for our purposes in the webinar today. So eligible costs, we're going to run through these. They span over a couple of slides. It goes from everything from site acquisition, which could be vacant land or an existing building that you'd like to use for library purposes. It could be adjacent to your existing property. It could be completely separate from your property, but you could get reimbursed for up to half of the purchase cost of that vacant land or building if there's also a building on it. This one is complicated by the date by which you finish the purchase. We will have to have a conversation if this is something you're considering of when you would actually sign the contract for the property. We do need to time that appropriately within the grant's timeline, and we can help you do that and think that through if that's a situation you're faced with. New construction is very obviously eligible in the regulation, whether you're building new, adding onto your existing building, or even if you have a multi-phased project, meaning it's a big project and you want to break it into smaller bits over the course of 2 or 3 grant cycles, which a number of libraries in our system has done. You could apply for just demolition and site prep, and then next year you could apply for some other component of your project. So we can help you phase out your program if that's something that is necessary. And I'll just put in a plug there. For a lot of association libraries in our system, that is the way they need to do this, because you do need to prove you have all of the money in hand you need to finish a project, to instill confidence to the Division of Library Development that you can finish the project once you've been awarded money through this program. So for very large projects, you'll see those libraries parse out their grant asks into a couple of years, and that's one thing that's very clearly eligible through the grant program. So moving on to the more common area that libraries are usually applying in is the idea of renovation and rehab of our existing building stock that libraries are using currently to deliver library services in their community. And you can see we've itemized things that libraries pretty consistently apply for, everything from solar panels to new roofs to reimagining your space and moving walls around, handicap accessible projects for entryways and bathrooms. If you have HVAC issues, replacing boilers, that's able to be done under the energy conservation category. Access issues related to your driveway, sidewalk, and parking lots, which we know some libraries are looking at this year in particular. And I'll just make a note there on that last one, that if within the context of a construction or renovation project, you also are purchasing new furniture and computers and shelving, you could be reimbursed for that under the program. But it has to be tied to new or newly reconfigured space that was part of your construction program as well. You may not only apply for new furniture, equipment, and shelving. It has to be in the context of a construction project that's happening within the same time frame of your grant ask, and there needs to be some construction element in the project costs you identify in your application. So when we think about renovation, we just want to be really clear. It's the overall improvement or conversion of an existing building, exclusive of routine maintenance. And what they're looking for is increased operational efficiency and economy. So they really want you to be able to prove that you are bettering service for the public through your work, or creating staff efficiencies that will also improve the quality of library services provided through your space. They're not going to entertain things they classify as routine maintenance. So if you have a standalone project for carpet replacement, or you just need a new coat of paint on the building, they will not fund that. It needs to actually be construction and renovation work falling into the categories that you see itemized here. They do allow for, when they say rehabilitation, I think a more common word we would probably use is restoration of an existing library building. Now, we have a lot of historic buildings in the MidHudson region, so some libraries have been able to get historic preservation elements included in their asks that have been eligible. So if that's the box you fall in, let me know. We can talk through what you'd like to do and how we might best sell it, or we could actually get a determination from the Division of Library Development before you go through this whole process to make sure they would actually fund what you would like to do. So some standalone items that don't quite fit into some of the other categories that we wanted to make sure were highlighted. Other eligible items, and some of these are very new within the past 3 years, they've been approved. So you can see emergency generators are now eligible under the program, and that can be a standalone program. Outdoor signage, the Marlboro Library was actually the first library in the state to get money from this program for outdoor signage, which has been fantastic for them. They have an electronic sign they can program from inside the library, so no more shuffling those letters on the sign each week to change your message to the community. Assisted listening devices for your program spaces. You can actually pay for construction management services through the grant, and you can pay for broadband connectivity. So when they say broadband to your building, they're talking about high-speed internet connection for library users, which could mean internal and external connections. So what they would like to see is obviously more and more libraries getting up to speed in terms of actually offering real broadband in areas in particular that it's not widely offered. So having libraries be able to be that place where you can be guaranteed to get broadband connectivity is something they altered the regulations to ensure could be funded through this grant program. So an important thing to keep in mind if that's an issue, if you live in a part of the state, and particularly in Greene and Columbia County, where you might need that last mile to come to the library, you could help to subsidize that through this program. And brand new, they slipped it in last year, almost under the wire. You can now pay for architectural and engineering plans for board-approved projects. So when they say locally approved, that's what that means. If the board has voted to move forward on a project and they are absolutely pursuing it, then yes, you could fold in your architectural and engineering plans into the scope of the project you apply for. However, if you're doing what they call speculative architectural or engineering plans, those are not eligible under the grant program, which would mean, you guys might have a spark of an idea that, yeah, we need to expand the library. Let's contract with an architect and get a feel for what our options are and how much that might cost us. You would not be able to get reimbursed at that phase of your thinking. It would only be once you'd considered the options, figured out your capital finance plan, and were ready to move forward, and the grant program was part of your finance plan. At that point, we could get you some reimbursement for those architectural and engineering plans through the program. So let's take a look at what's not eligible and be really clear about this. We've already talked about the first two. Routine maintenance item, usually standalone carpeting, standalone painting. Anything that really you would have to be done on an annual basis cannot be paid for through the grant program. And we just talked about speculative architectural and engineering firm fees, which means you haven't quite committed to the project yet. Those would not be eligible under the program. Same deal if you hired a building consultant, maybe someone to come in and do space planning for you. That would not be eligible currently under the program. You can't pay for your interest on bonds if you're a public library that's financed the project through bonding, nor can you use mortgage payments as part of your grant ask as an association library. No purchase of books or other library materials, and landscaping is specifically called out. So if we think this through, no standalone landscaping projects. However, if you had some element of landscaping perhaps that was necessary to improve accessibility to your building, there might be ways to get elements of that paid for through the grant. And that's, again, something I can help you with. If you think you might be on the line when it comes to, in particular, the landscaping or the routine maintenance issue, just give me a call. We'll talk it out, and we'll figure out if we can get your project funded through this program. So that's what's eligible in regulation. And now we mentioned that here at MidHudson, we're asked to provide recommended award amounts for the libraries that apply. And the way we've had to do this in the past few years, given the volume of ask, which is usually 3 times as much money as we have from the state to give out, we had to find a way to prioritize who would get money and how much money people would get. So the MidHudson board, who are elected by you, the members of the MidHudson library system, have put forth 5 prioritized categories they're looking for that are coupled with 2 items. So there's a total of 7 things to keep in mind here. 1 is that your project must be part of a board-approved prioritized facility plan, which you report to us, you submit to us through that action memo we just talked about. And again, if you need help coming up with a facility plan, or you're not quite sure what we're talking about related to that, I'm here to help you with that. And we've seen a 30% increase in the number of libraries that have a facility plan just in the past year. So we know a lot of libraries are out there hard at work getting this in place. So that's the first thing we're looking for. The next thing we're looking for is that your project is actually eligible under the regulations that we just reviewed. So that's kind of a given in the program, but you'd be surprised some of the applications we received that have really been out there and not paid attention to the regulations at all. So thank you very much for being on this webinar this morning so that you're not one of those applications. And then we have a point process that projects have to earn at least 1 point in one of these 5 categories. So are you actually going to achieve, this is outcome based, an increase in services thanks to the project you want to work on? So for example, if you're going to reconfigure your space or add on to your space and add on a new service point, maybe a room for programming that you've never had before, that would very clearly be an increase in services to the public that would automatically get a point. Another category is increase in access. And this, we use the word access in 2 ways. One is handicap accessibility. It's a huge issue in the MidHudson region. Close to 54% of member library facilities are not fully handicap accessible. So when we think about being, libraries for everyone, that's a pretty fundamental issue that should be addressed through library facility planning. So the board is very interested in seeing projects that address getting your building entrance and bathrooms in particular fully handicap accessible. They've also allowed the definition of access to apply to a project that would increase access to your building for a population that hadn't been targeted before. So an example for this might be down in the Mahopac Library. They've reconfigured the space to create a teen area, a place for teens to come and be after school. And that's a population that really never had a spot in the building before. And so the board has also allowed that interpretation of access to be addressed through this point system. So you could potentially earn 2 points, that it's not just an increase in services for your teen programming. If you can demonstrate you never had a way to serve that population before, and you will now through this project, you potentially could get those 2 points towards this program. Energy conservation is another area that is very clearly prioritized both in regulation and by the MidHudson board. You'll actually note the first 3 priorities here are directly from regulation, and MidHudson adopted them because we saw the state prioritize them, so it made sense for us to do that as well. So energy conservation we're going to talk about a little more today because it is more complicated than the first 2. We'll also dive into disaster recovery and leadership in sustainable design a little more in the next few slides. So for the energy conservation item, there's 2 things to keep in mind. It's not a vendor's perception that you will save money through energy conservation. We actually are looking to see that you are basing energy conservation projects on expert opinion. So that means we're looking to see, have you had an energy assessment or audit done? And if you're not clear on what that is or what to ask for when you go to an engineering firm to get an energy audit, you want to ask for a level 2 ASHRAE energy audit. And if you're not sure what that is, I'm happy to chat with you about it. If you've had an energy audit done in the past, many libraries took advantage of a program through the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority a number of years ago, which was able to provide free energy audits to libraries in the state. Unfortunately, that program no longer exists. But if you have one of those reports in hand and it's less than 5 years old, we would also accept that. So once you decide that you are going to move forward with recommendations in your energy conservation or energy assessment reports you've received, we're also looking to see that you're following what's called the Useful Life Energy Conservation Standards, which you can find at midhudson.org/NYS Construction Grant. But really what it's saying is they want to see you using Energy Star approved materials for roofing, HVAC equipment, windows, and doors. We find that we need a standard in place to ensure quality energy conservation work being done. It's an area we feel there's a lot of workers in the Hudson Valley that are just trying to make a buck off the trend of sustainable buildings and energy conservation, and we're trying to give libraries a fighting chance to make sure money is spent wisely and the choices that you make actually have the performance outcomes that are promised. And these are two ways we found to help libraries do that. Now, the next item was related to disaster recovery, and this is new in the past 3 years. It was a relatively new category that we have to earn a point in. Again, this doesn't apply to your project, no problem. You're still eligible. You can still apply. You can still earn one of the other 4 points. But disaster recovery is specifically to help libraries who have suffered a catastrophic loss. And we're looking here at low probability, high consequence events. So this isn't that you forgot to call the repair guy to service your boiler for several years and it blew up. These are things like floods, fire, things that were completely unexpected, out of your control, and shut down the library and prevented access to your building. This program and our board are interested in helping libraries get up and running as fast as possible after disaster strikes. And if you find yourself in that category, as some of our libraries have in the past few years, the board wants to recognize that by awarding an additional point in the formula to those libraries. Now, the last category is something that is really about the name of our committee that oversees this program, the Incentive Committee, looking to incentivize libraries that are taking a leadership role in building more sustainable library buildings in the Hudson Valley. And this is, again, not just your architect says it's more sustainable, but you're actually using an accepted program, such as one of the 5 programs you see noted here on this slide. From the Leader in Energy and Environmental Design Program, LEED, Green Globes, Living Building Challenge, Energy Star rated buildings, or Passive House rated buildings would all be eligible for this point. And we're excited that some libraries are starting to talk about this and think about this. Even if we don't get the point awarded in the next year or two, we're excited to spark the conversation in this area to make sure we have healthy buildings that are built for the long haul that keep our operating costs down. So again, you want to be able to hit at least one of those 5 categories of points to be considered for funding. If your project falls outside all 5 of those categories, which honestly I think you'd have to work pretty hard to do, you would not be eligible for funds through the program. So you must speak to one of those 5, if not more than one of those 5, in your narrative of how your project relates to those funding priorities. So just to be really clear, it's not just about what's eligible, it also has to line up with those funding priorities to make sure you're eligible in the program. And we'll show you through the technical assistance workshops, we have a narrative, a grant narrative worksheet for you to help you make sure you've spoken to the points that make sure it's very clear to the committee that reviews these that yes, you do match the funding priorities. So again, something to put a little note next to yourself or to remind yourself when you're writing the narrative, you might want that worksheet before you start writing. So this is a matching grant program through the state. The regulation as it stands notes that you can receive up to 50% of your total project approved costs. And it says project approved costs because you might have a big project that you're applying for, and some elements of it are eligible and some are not. Meaning maybe you've got a big renovation project, you're adding an expansion onto the library, a component of that in your mind for the total project cost includes landscaping, but as we identified, that's an ineligible cost through the state aid program, so we'd have to excise that amount when we're calculating the recommended award amount. So it's up to 50% of your total project approved costs, and note it says up to 50%, so you're not guaranteed 50%. That will be based on how many libraries apply for funding this year and how much people ask for. So that's a variable we can't quite tell you until I get all those action memos back and I can see who wants to apply, how big their projects are. We'll have a better sense of that in late May. But there's a new caveat to the regulation that allows for potentially up to 75% of your total project approved costs being reimbursed under the program if the community, your chartered service community, meets the definition for an economically disadvantaged community. And here's the definition that we're working off of. And this is also available through the website that we noted to you. So there's three potential ways your service population might be eligible for the 75% threshold for matching grant money. So they're looking for if your chartered service area has 15% or more of the population living in poverty. That's using the latest federal census data. Or if you meet the threshold of a public school district with a percentage of student enrollment for free and reduced lunch at 40% or more for at least 1 month during the 12-month period prior to the date that you're filing that application. Or the third option is if you have a combo of those two things at lower thresholds. If you've got 10% or more of the population living in poverty and a school district in which 30% or more are within the National School Lunch Program, that would also trigger you being eligible for the lower match requirement, meaning you could get a maximum of 75% of your total project costs potentially reimbursed through the program. So that's something to look up if you're not familiar with those statistics in your service area to see which bucket you might fall into, the 50% match or the 75% match. That can make a big difference for smaller libraries in rural areas. So I don't want anyone to be disappointed later on. I'm sure you'll be disappointed anyway if this happens, but we do want to make it really clear that regardless of the recommended award amount that we contact you with in September, which could be less than 50%, you will need to match the remainder of the project costs to move forward in the program. And again, in September, you'll be given the opportunity to consider your situation. If the amount that's recommended is pretty close to the amount that you were hoping for and you feel you can move forward, fantastic. Maybe you have all the money in hand and you're just looking to get anything you can out of the program. Awesome, move forward. But some libraries do find themselves in a pinch when the recommended award amounts come in. It might be just little less than they needed to actually match it and they can't quite make it happen. You do have an out in late September to say, no, this is not for us this year. But that is an important decision point to be paying attention to and make sure you're right on top of it when we contact you about your recommended award amount. So just taking a look at this timeline again and where we are on things, I'm reviewing this again with you because we're about to explain something that is not necessarily logical. So I want to make sure this is in your mind before we talk about the next thing. Just a reminder, the grant opens June 1 and is due August 3rd. Those are two dates to keep in mind as we think about the next slide and the information from the state related to timing and what's eligible related to timing. So before we noted that the grant program period runs from July 1st of this year to June 30th of 2021. So when we think about what is eligible under the grant program, sometimes we'll get a question from a library that they've already started a project this year, but they'd still like to apply for it. And you might still be able to do that with a couple of caveats. You have to ensure that you have not spent any money before January of this year, because anything spent between January 1st and July 1, if you've paid it out already on the project, you could include it in your total project cost and use it as proof of matching money. However, anything you've spent prior to January 1st cannot be included in your total project scope and is not reimbursable under the grant program. The other thing you need to keep in mind timing-wise is that you cannot have finished your project before August 3rd. So our grant deadline is August 3rd here in the system. When you read the regulation, it very clearly says the project cannot be complete at the time of application. And we define the time of application not in June, but at August 3rd to give you that maximum window to think through when your project timing is going to happen. We understand some projects make more sense to get done in the summer, and this grant timeline doesn't always work for libraries in that respect. So these are some kind of parentheses to keep in mind in terms of what money has been spent, what could be included in your grant application, what's reimbursable and what's not. So this might be another thing that if you find yourself in this situation and you want to walk through the timing and the money issue, just to line that all up appropriately, we're happy to help you with that. So we've really just so far reviewed the regulations, what's eligible, what MidHudson prioritizes for funding through our systems process. And we haven't talked too much about the application. And I'll say it's difficult to talk about the application when it's not in front of you. And we can't put it in front of you until they open the portal on June 1st. But what we can do is predict the work that needs to get done so that you're all ready to go when the application is open. So they call the whole thing an application, but the truth is there's an online application form and then quite a few attachments that you will download from their website and then upload to your grant application to complete the full application to the state. The application form will have your basic information. You'll be putting in your address and the basics about your project, the name of the project and how much you're asking for, where your matching money is going to be coming from. And then you're going to be inputting narratives. You're going to be doing a 5-part narrative. One is a brief abstract. Then you're having a description of what you are applying for. And then most importantly, the impact statement, which is why you are applying for it, which is where you can identify the outcomes that you will achieve from what you are doing in the scope of the project. Then you're outlining your timetable, which you're not necessarily held to, but they do want to see that you're going to start within 180 days of being notified in June of next year. So you'll have 3 months after being notified to get started. You must start within 180 days and provide written notice to the state that you've done so. And they also want to see in your timetable that you can complete the project by June 30th, 2021. They'll also ask you for a budget narrative, which is just taking your contractor quotes or your vendor quotes and explaining them in narrative form to make sure it's very clear what each item is and why it's included in the quote that you have. So your contractor quote documents will need to be on contractor letterhead. And just a pro tip here, you may not use architect's estimates for this purposes. They actually have to be quotes. So you've gone out to bid and you've gotten your quotes, or you've gotten one quote that you're fairly confident in. You are not bound by that quote at the end of the day. So let's say you get a quote here in April of 2018. You don't get final notification you've received the grant until June of 2019, and perhaps conditions on the ground have changed. This person's gone out of business, or raw material costs have fluctuated and changed the quote amount. The grant program does not force you to use the quote that you uploaded. You could go out to bid later in your process to get a better quote, but you will be held to the amount. So you want to think carefully about, I could just run out, get one quote, I'll just use that for the grant purposes. But if you want to be smart, you want to cross-reference that with 2 or 3 other quotes to make sure the price you actually put into your grant application is in the ballpark of what it's probably going to cost you a year from now if you're not going to start until next summer. So just something to think through. And now is the time to think about that. When we think about procrastinating on grant writing, there's some things you control and there's some things other people control. And when you get a contractor in your door to give you a quote is not in your control. So the sooner you start on that, probably the better for the grant writing purposes. You'll be asked to prove you have matching funds in hand. So that could be a bank statement or a letter from a legislator when they've awarded you a special legislative grant. It can be a letter from your treasurer identifying that there is a capital fund or a capital reserve fund and that X amount of money has been earmarked in that account for the purposes of matching the grant. Any of those 3 things would be acceptable as proof of matching funds. If you don't own your building but you lease it, there is a requirement that you prove you have a lease that is at least for 10 years beyond the date of application. Not too many libraries in our region have that situation, but just make a note if that is you. The next one only applies to you if your building is owned by a school district, which is very rare. I think we only have 3 of those out of 66 in our whole system. So if that's you, you definitely know it, and you know that you're in the mix to go through the Office of Facilities Planning in Albany to get your project signed off on. Now the next one, I'm sorry, it's an acronym. I should have spelled that out. SHPO stands for the State Historic Preservation Office. If your building is more than 50 years old, 50 years old, you need approval from SHPO, except for certain circumstances that have been negotiated with the state library. So that documentation to figure out if you do need SHPO approval, if you're in a building that's over 50 years old, is available through the website. We're going to give you at the end of the workshop, so you can read through that and figure that out. I'm also available to help you figure that out. You will be filing a short environmental assessment form. So if you have a big project, this is not intimidating to you because you've gone through a seeker process, you've got all this paperwork related to that, you know exactly what to do. For smaller projects, this might seem intimidating, but really it's a 4-page form. Just work your way through it, answer the questions, and just be honest about what you're doing. We can also help you fill that out. The smart growth form, it's again another agency's form that looks a little intimidating, but it's actually quite straightforward. They're asking how where your library is physically situated speaks to the idea of smart growth, which is using existing building stock, maintaining the feel of a downtown or the heart of a village. And most libraries can easily make the case for why their project fits in with the idea of smart growth. The next two forms, the FS10 form and the pay information form, are financial forms with very specific instructions from the state library that are different from the instructions you will find on the forms themselves. So this is a good reminder that you have to compare both the instructions on the state library's website with instructions on the forms themselves. So if that sounds weird to you, you're right, it is weird. But if you want to come to the technical assistance workshop we're going to do in June, we'll walk you through those forms and answer any questions that you might have for it. They want photographs, before and after photographs, so a good thing to keep in mind if you're starting work very soon to run into the library and take some pictures before that work gets started. And then the board will have to sign an assurances form at their meeting. So if we want to think about the deadline is August 3rd, that means your board meeting prior to August 3rd, the board should be signing off on your assurances form. And the assurances form basically is asking the board to acknowledge they're applying for the grant, commit to following all laws and regulations surrounding the construction project, and if the building is leased, they're acknowledging that they're going to be there for at least 10 years. So something to put in your calendar of when that form should be signed. The date on that one might not be August 3rd. It might be a couple weeks before that at the board meeting prior to that deadline. So again, just to reiterate, you could be working right now on some of this stuff. You could be, getting out there, getting your quote figures. Reminder, you can't use your architect's estimates. We talked a little bit about the State Historic Preservation approval, the SHPO approval. A reminder, if you find out you do need approval from them, they have 30 days to respond to you. So again, if this is something you dragged your feet on and you don't get to the middle of July, they could be the reason you missed the deadline for the grant application. So again, figuring that stuff out now will really pay off for you later when we get closer to the deadline. The energy audit, if you want to do a project related to that and your energy assessment is older than 5 years or you don't have one at all, you still have time to get one of those. You'll need to register, and this is a fairly simple process, for a New York State Directory Service account. That actually is what gives you your login information when the portal opens. And it's not instantaneous when you register for it. Most things, when you create an online account, you put in your information and it outspits your login information. This can take 24, 48 hours before they turn around and give you your account information. So again, not something that you want to be waiting for once the portal opens. And you are asked what your New York State vendor ID is. And if that's something you've never heard of before, chances are you don't have one, and you'll have to apply to get one, which again is not too onerous, but it's another task that will take some time. And information about how to do both of those things is available at midhudson.org/NYS construction grant /. And just that other reminder about getting photos before your project begins. So at the website we've mentioned a few times here, you can get a lot of the stuff that we've mentioned today. Those director service account, which is what you need to log in, your vendor numbers that are asked for on some of the financial forms, the State Historic Preservation Office approval documentation. And what that is, again, for libraries who are in buildings that are more than 50 years old, your first step is not to call SHPO. Your first step is to read through that documentation to see if what you want to do is already covered in that documentation. Because then all you have to do is cite the aspect of the documentation that applies to your project and your application, and you're good to go. However, if what you want to do is not covered in that documentation, you will go through the online approval process for SHPO approval of your project, which again, they have 30 days to respond to you. So you'll want to check out the calendar for by when you'd want to have that information into them. Any questions about that, you can certainly give me a call. I'm happy to help out with that. You can also read the full MidHudson board priorities for funding. When we reviewed those, you can see expanded language with some examples related to that, and our definition for the economically disadvantaged community to see if you fall into the 50% match category or the up to 75% match category. So we mentioned some technical assistance coming up for the application. We have an in-person workshop here at MidHudson in Poughkeepsie on Tuesday, June 19th from 10 to noon in the morning in the auditorium. And that's where we'll actually go through every single screen of the application online and show you every single form that you're going to have to fill out and attach to your application and get you a big leg up on doing all of that work. So if you are intimidated by the list of things you had to have done, that might be a good place for you to come. If you've never done the application before, I highly recommend that workshop. If you've done it before, particularly in the past 2 or 3 years, you probably don't need that workshop. You can manage your work on your own and by using the one-on-one consultations that will be offered throughout July. And again, those consultations can be booked in person, on the phone, and online, whatever suits your schedule best. So I just like to close out my portion of the event by just saying, just work through the steps. There's a lot to do related to this grant application, so I do beg of you not to procrastinate. I will provide a deadline by which, if you'd like help, where I can help you, and if you want review of your narratives, where I can help you. But we do have to keep in mind I am one person and there are many people who would like to apply for this grant. So as we get closer to the application deadline of August 3rd, if you've dragged your feet on stuff and haven't taken advantage of the technical assistance that's been offered, my window to help you becomes smaller and smaller. And I know that's a very stressful time as a deadline approaches, and I will absolutely do my best to help you. But I do ask for your help in starting the process early, thinking through questions you might have early on, so we have plenty of time to get you the help you need to maximize your success in this grant program. Most of you on the call today, I see, know me pretty well and know how to get in contact with me. If we haven't worked together before, here's my email address and my phone number. And my job is to help you as much as I can get the money through this program. So again, fill out that action memo. I'll then create a list of libraries that I know want to apply this year, and you'll be added onto an email list that will get the most up-to-date information about when the grant portal opens, when the tech one-on-one tech assistance stuff opens up to sign up for, and you'll just be in the loop. So even if you're on the fence this year and you think, I think we could do it, but I'm not 100% sure, go ahead and say you intend to apply. If you, as you get down the path, realize this is not the year for you, you can always drop out. But it's much harder when you don't say you'd like to apply and then July 1st call me and say, oh, I think I want to do it. And then all of a sudden we've got a lot of extra work to do to help you get going on this process. So again, take pity on yourself. And if you're not quite sure, go ahead and say you're going to apply. Easier to pull out than it is to get in later in this process. So I haven't seen any questions come in through the chat box so far, but I am certainly willing to answer any questions through chat. And you, again, can always send me questions through the contact info. So a question did just come through from Brian at Pauling. He's asking, does accepting money through this program require us to use prevailing wage or to filter any computers we purchase with government funds? So I'll take the easier one first, which is whether or not this money would trigger having to filter content on public access computers. The answer to that is no. No state money would trigger requiring filters on computers. As to your first question, Brian, this question depends on what type of library you are. So for those of you who aren't sure what I mean by that, a type of library, if you're an association library, municipal, special district, or school district. If you are a public library, which means special district, school district, or municipal public library, yes, you must pay prevailing wage. For association libraries, you are not inherently required to pay prevailing wage on construction projects. The language related to prevailing wage on the state library's website related to this grant program reiterates that by law you are not required to use prevailing wage, but that you're welcome to request a designation or a determination through the Department of Labor if you so choose. But the state library does not declare that this changes your status as to not having to provide prevailing wage, and will give you that citation from the state library's website if that's useful to you. All right, I don't see any other questions coming through, and we are kind of close to our end time. I will post the recording of this webinar, the slides you just took a look at, and the link to the website we referred you to for more information to everyone who's registered for the workshop this morning to make sure you have all of that stuff. We'll have registration for that tech assistance workshop turned on shortly, and make sure you have notice of that as well. And again, please do get that action memo in by May 25th. That's really your first step in all of this this process. So we wish you the best of luck this year if you're going to apply. And again, please do consider us a resource to help you through this process.